Good morning and welcome everybody to Generosity, Stewardship, and Abundance, a conversation with Lovett, Weems, and Michel. Glad you could join us on this June 2nd. We're happy to be here with this presentation. My name's Dave Durham. I'm with the Stewardship Committee of the National Capital Presbytery. We're bringing this special webinar presentation today. I'm also Stewardship Chair of Darnestown Presbyterian Church. We've got a very exciting program today. I think it's going to be very conversational, maybe less formal. I think you'll like that. First, though, I'm going to go through a few housekeeping items just so we make sure we're all on the same page. We are recording this session, so that means this will be available. If you have to leave early, or if you just want to go back and review it afterwards, or probably even more important, if you want to pass it on to colleagues or members of your church after it's done, we'll send you an email with this when it's ready and I'll post it up on the website. Give us a little bit of time to get it ready, so 24 to 48 hours, but we'll make sure you get a link to that so you can share this webinar or go back and review it again. The other thing is, again, this is going to be a conversation. We go through it first, but we'd also like to get your questions as we go through the presentation. So we'll use the Q&A box to add your questions in there. We'll make sure we read them and get to them. We'll try to get to all we can. We have about an hour and a half here to 1 p.m. So we're very conscious of your time and don't want to overdo it. But we certainly want to get your participation in this event. And finally, what you're seeing here, Generosity, Stewardship, and Abundance, is also a book written by Lovett, and we'll put a link in the chat box later to access a special discount to that book. And we'll also have some other links of some other resources, free resources and materials you can use to help with the stewardship. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Molina Moore, our General Presbytery of the National Capital Presbytery, to open us up with prayer. John?
Thanks, Dave. Welcome to all of you. We're so thrilled that you are here and a chance to learn more about generosity and how we can better serve our churches. So let me open us with a word of prayer. Where are we still? In the morning? We start in the morning this morning. Let's go to God in prayer. Loving and generous God, we thank you so much that you are a generous God who gives us so much and gives us all the tools that we need to help grow this church. We ask that this time might be one that is blessed and one that is filled with ideas and opportunities and potential to see how we can continue to do the work that you have called each of us and our churches to do in this world. We thank you for voices like Lovett and voices who are here to Ann and to share wisdom and insight on best practice and how we can continue to do this work of the church together. Bless this time, bless these leaders, and we pray this in your amazing and beautiful name. Amen.
Thank you, John. Okay. We're very excited, the Stewardship Committee of NCP, to be presenting Lovett and Ann. I think you'll find this again. This could be a conversation we're going to have. We're a lot to go through. First, Lovett Weems is Wesley Seminary Distinguished Professor of Church Leadership, and he's the founding director and senior consultant of Wesley's Lewis Center for Church Leadership. He's published over 15 books and leadership on the challenges of the church today. Ann Michel is Associate Director of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership of Wesley Theological Seminary and teaches in the areas of stewardship and leadership, very appropriate for today. She's also an author of Synergy, a leadership guide for the church and staff and volunteers. So what we're going to do, this is going to be a conversation. I've had the privilege of attending several sessions at Wesley Learning Center, and it's been very helpful, very useful. Lovett has been a very inspirational speaker, and so I think you're going to find this very helpful as we go through it. But we're going to take it in less of a formal presentation and more in a conversation. So the first question really is going to go to Ann. We'll start off. Ann, how can what you've written in this book, guide churches as we enter the post-pandemic period?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. Before I get into it, I really want to thank you for the opportunity to talk with you and just say that this book that Lovett and I have written, Generosity, Stewardship, and Abundance, is really a comprehensive guide to kind of soup to nuts, all the different things churches need to be thinking about when they're thinking about their generosity ministry, as well as their use of congregational resources. And it grows out of work that we've been doing over several decades in leading workshops and teaching seminarians, and the work that we've done to help congregations and other institutions with their economic sustainability. So we're very excited to be sharing some of that with you today. The first question, how can what we've written guide churches as we enter this post-pandemic period? Not surprisingly, as we have been talking about this book with different groups, this is what is top of mind for people right now, because we are in such a uncertain and disruptive period as we're coming out of the pandemic. But I think one thing that everyone needs to keep in mind as we are emerging from the COVID period is that while it is a period of great disruption and uncertainty, it's also a time in which no two churches are exactly in the same situation. We are learning more each day that the pandemic did not have the same financial effect on every individual and household. Some have suffered greatly. Losing houses, losing jobs, losing businesses. But there are other individuals who have come through the pandemic quite well, and in some cases even better off if they've been able to cut back on expenses and receive government stimulus checks and see their retirement account increase in value. The same is true of churches. There are churches that have been forced into closure, and there will likely be more. But there are also churches that have done quite well, that have managed to sustain their giving, reduce their expenses, churches that receive PPP loans, for example. So everyone is in a really different situation as we enter this post-pandemic period. And so I would say the first critical lesson is to not make assumptions, to really take stock of what's going on in your church with regard to your finances and your giving, and to also really pay attention to what the situation is with your givers and your congregants. This is one of the themes in our book, the importance of paying attention and the importance of knowing your givers. That's good advice at any time, but it's particularly good and important advice now, that you don't just make assumptions about what's going on. It was interesting to be writing this book. We were doing the writing of the book during the early months of the pandemic, and I was continually asking myself the question, how does this change what we have to say? And over again, I concluded that the basic practices that we outline in our book, sort of the fundamentals of generosity and stewardship, are just as relevant now as they were during and after the pandemic. So I think that the same sort of basics are absolutely applicable in this post-pandemic period. But I also want to lift up what is one of the subtexts of our book, which is that while it's very important that churches master the basics and do a good job, do even a better job at the fundamentals of generosity and stewardship, we also live in a time when it's important that we think beyond the basics. We live in a time that really demands what I call creative both and thinking. And this isn't just true with regard to generosity and stewardship, it's true with every aspect of church life now. It isn't just true during and after the pandemic, it was really true before the pandemic, because the church had already been in a time of change and transition, moving from an attractional to a post-attractional period. And in many areas of church life, the pandemic has just accelerated a movement that was already underway. I think perhaps the best example of this is digital giving, because one of the major lessons of the pandemic was, of course, the importance of digital giving. And if there's been a silver lining in the pandemic, it's that churches that had dragged their feet for years or even decades finally realized that they had to take a leap into the 21st century and develop ways for their congregations to give electronically. So, establishing the ability for people to give electronically is one of the basics of a good generosity ministry. But what I have come to see, particularly during this pandemic period, as we're coming out of it, and as more of the church's ministries are now sort of frontward facing on the digital frontier, that there's even a greater promise in digital giving than we had realized before. I think up until this point, we saw digital giving as a more convenient way for someone who may have already, who may normally put their offering in the plate on Sunday morning. Digital giving became a more convenient way for them to give, a way for the church to receive revenue streams more regularly. Those are important advantages, but I think there's an even greater promise to digital giving. I think that as the church continues to advance on the digital frontier, digital giving is going to more and more become the way in which the church engages and grows new givers. And so I think what we're going to see is a need to develop new capacities, not only to receive digital gifts, but to learn how to cultivate donors through electronic appeals. And if you think about the way other nonprofits are raising money and connecting with their constituencies in this day, they're doing it through a lot of electronic communication and electronic appeals. And I think as we come out of the pandemic, we're going to see the future of the church's generosity ministry moving increasingly online. So that's kind of the big things that I see related to the post-pandemic period.
Thank you. And I couldn't agree with you more about the digital giving. I think that's leading into some very exciting and new areas with that. So great. The next question is going to be for Lovett. I've read the book. I just got it and finished it a couple of days ago. In your book, you outlined the best practices for budgeting. How would you recommend churches approach the task of budgeting during the time of considerable uncertainty?
Thank you, Dave. And I join Ann in gratitude for this opportunity to be with you. I've been impressed over the years with what your presbytery does related to stewardship, as much as virtually any judicatory I'm aware of in any denomination. And we've enjoyed other opportunities to be with you in the past. At first glance, this question appears to be a very nuts and bolts kind of question. What do we do? What do we do first? And what do we do next? But it's a question that really pushes us back to some basic principles. And I think as you think about your budget for the new year, you need to begin by thinking about a concept that Presbyterian church historian James Hudnut Buehler uses of commonwealth. That is, think of every dollar that's given to your church, including all those dollars that have been given, that have been converted into property and assets. Every dollar given to your church makes up the common wealth of your congregation. Therefore, this common wealth can only be used for one purpose, and that is to fulfill the mission. So as you think about that budget, it's not how does our church get through another year, but how do we fulfill the mission? Another basic understanding is to be clear on what your leadership role as leaders is. It's twofold. One, in building that budget, you need to fulfill that mission as well as your resources permit you to. And your second goal is to sustain that mission. Survival is not a worthy goal. but sustaining a worthy mission is. If you believe that God has called your congregation to do a special work in a special place at a special time, and this is good and worthy and godly, then you should always be asking not only how do we fulfill our mission, but how do we sustain that mission? And it's the role of leadership to hold these two values together. So, having that background, how do we begin thinking about next year's budget? Because just as churches are beginning to reopen in an in-person way, the task of the next year's budget is really upon us. First of all, you've got to assess what are the changes that have taken place. As Ann said, think of paying attention as a spiritual discipline. What are the changes? Where are we at this point in the year? Even though your task is planning for the next year, you've got to see where are we now? And what we do between now and the end of our fiscal year is one issue that can, in a sense, stand on its own, just as a new budget year can stand on its own. They're related. Where you are now will shape decisions in the new budget year. There may be some steps you take now that would not be appropriate in your new budget year. So let's think about your operating budget. The definition of an operating budget is that it ought to cover your current expenses through recurring and predictable income. This permits you to fulfill the two goals of fulfilling the mission and sustaining the mission. So, on the one hand, you have to really begin on the income side. And so as you look at all the various streams of income, what does your best knowledge at this point tell you about what you can reasonably expect in the next year? Certainly there have been some changes in giving patterns. Perhaps you've lost people to COVID or other situations. Just as in any year, you need to pay attention to those. But many of our churches have multiple streams of income, which is a good thing. Keep asking yourself, what sources of income do we have for the operating budget that are recurring and predictable? Now, predictable doesn't mean you know exactly what it's going to be. For instance, there may be a stream of income you have for people who use your building for various one-time functions and pay a fee for that. You may not know exactly what that's going to be, but you certainly know what your, typical 3-year running average of something might be on that. So predictable and recurring. Now, one thing to think about is if your church has an endowment, you want to think about, well, what is our spending rate? Because sometimes the spending rate becomes so high that it's not recurring and predictable if you are eating into the value of it. So you want to make sure that your spending rate's conservative enough that you're able, through any 5 to 8 year period would have total return that would equal your spending rate plus the rate of inflation, so that you're protecting that value, so that it's not just used for your generation, but it's available as it was intended to be used forever. Now, on the expense side, look at what you learned from the pandemic. We've learned that some things don't have to be done in the same way. Perhaps we've learned that some things really aren't missed at all. I mean, there may be a way to save money there. Maybe you've already had to make some adjustments, and perhaps some of those will need to remain. But you're also learning that there's some things that you've needed to improve or to begin doing during the pandemic that you really need to continue, maybe not in the same way, but enhancements where you'll need to spend some extra money. So the goal is to start as early as possible, get as much information as possible, and then try to put together that next budget in a way that fulfills the mission and sustains the mission, covers all your expected current expenses, and covering it with recurring and predictable income.
Thank you, Lovett. Yes, I agree there. Again, that's very good advice with everything that is going on out there. Next question, follow up with this one's back to Ann. I know different churches are coming back into people worship depending on where they are and what is allowed in their community or in their county or their state. How should churches approach commitment campaigns in light of the current reality?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I think it's a really important one because if your church has traditionally relied on a commitment campaign, by all means, my first answer to that question would be do a commitment campaign. Last year, believe it or not, there were churches who just couldn't imagine doing a commitment campaign. They couldn't stretch their imagination to think about how they could possibly do it while they were in pandemic mode, or they were afraid of talking with their people about commitment during a time when there was economic uncertainty, and some decided just not to do campaigns. And I think they surely made their situation worse. And so my first word would be to say, if your congregation is one that has traditionally had a commitment campaign as part of their stewardship effort, then you want to make sure that you're planning a campaign for the fall. And this is, if you do your campaign in the fall, this is about the time of year when you should start thinking about how you're going to approach it. There's a chapter in our book that deals with pledges and commitment campaigns, and it shares a number of best practices. I think that there are two of those practices that are particularly relevant given the current reality. One is the idea that a sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to a commitment campaign never really works. It's not the most effective approach under normal circumstances, but I think under these particular circumstances, when, as I mentioned earlier, everyone's sort of in a different boat in terms of what the financial reality is that they're facing, I think it's even more important that when planning a commitment campaign, you look at ways to be a bit more personalized and tailor your messages according to people's circumstances. Now, part of that involves knowing what people's giving patterns have been. If every congregation has some people who are very generous givers, they're tithers, they're sacrificial givers, they're very regular, they're very faithful. Every congregation also has a large group of people who give, but maybe not quite as regularly or predictably. They've got room to grow in their giving. And then every congregation, believe it or not, has a fairly substantial group of people who just don't give at all. And one of the problems in a commitment campaign, if you just kind of broadcast the same message about giving and pledging to those different kinds of people, the message isn't going to be right for any of them. For someone who's never given a dime to the church before, I don't think it makes sense to ask them to start with a pledge or a tithe. On the other hand, if you've got people who are very regular and sacrificial givers, they need to hear a message of how important their giving is and how important it is for them to continue to be generous. And so I always recommend that in the context of a commitment campaign, a church thinks about ways it can tailor some different messages to meet the reality of those different kinds of givers. Now, that does mean that somebody needs to be paying attention to who gives what. But I think in this particular circumstances, when we know that people have been impacted differently by the pandemic, it makes even more sense to really take a look at the situation of your givers and not just use a one-size-fits-all. You might need to have some different messages or different events to talk to different people, depending on what their circumstance is. The other best practice with regard to commitment campaigns that I think is relevant in this time is that I usually advise congregations to periodically vary the approach that they take to their campaign. If you have done house parties for the last 3 years, you might find that you connect with some other people by switching this year to a letter writing campaign. This probably isn't the year for a Consecration Sunday model because you probably aren't going to have a lot of people gathering in person. I think, churches are all over the place in terms of where they are. Some churches are practically back to normal in terms of their practices. There are other churches that are really taking baby steps and don't really know yet where they're going to be in terms of their ability to meet face-to-face come fall. And so, you'll want to think about that. How can your campaign model fit with where your congregation is in terms of it resuming some of the regular practices of congregational life? But I think regardless, your goal needs to be to try to connect with your givers in the most personal way possible. That's always advice that I give. The more personal the message is, the more personal the appeal is, the more effective it's going to be. I think one of the positive outcomes for many churches during this pandemic period is they realize how powerful some digital platforms like Zoom can be in terms of creating a very rich emotional and relational connection. And so I know churches that did their campaigns last year via Zoom, and they found that was a really effective way to engage people in conversation around giving and even to secure commitments electronically. I think another kind of approach that might be useful in this particular environment might be personal letter writing campaigns. I've had good luck with that in my own church, dividing the congregation up among a number of leaders who will then personally write to people asking them for their pledges. And that can be a very personal and effective way. So, you need to think about where you are, whether you're back to normal and able to have a commitment Sunday or a consecration Sunday, or whether you need to, continue to rely on some socially distanced ways of engaging people. But either way, it's important to engage people as personally as you can. And so I would be looking to integrate that into your campaign planning as you go into the fall.
And a brief follow-up, can you just give an example of an approach you would take for the community of non-givers that have never given before?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I have come to believe that for people who just simply are non-contributors in your church, a pledge campaign doesn't really connect. Because if you have never given before, the idea that you're going to make a pledge or pledge a tithe is just that's a really big leap for somebody. And so I believe in one of my mantras is that people always give before they pledge your tithe. They always give before they pledge your tithe. And so somebody who's not a giver, I think the focus needs to be on inviting them to give rather than inviting them to make a pledge. And so when I have organized commitment campaigns in my own church, what I do is I segregate out the non-givers, and they receive a different kind of appeal. They're asked to make a gift. And the goal is to really remind them of the good work that the church does and encourage them simply to get started by making a gift. Since most pledge campaigns come toward the end of the year, a lot of people are thinking about making gifts anyways. And so that's the approach that I take. And then once someone starts giving, it makes more sense to talk with them about pledging.
Thank you. Very good, Ann. Thank you. Lovett, the next question here. This is one I know we've worked in our church very hard at. Talking about money in the church can be so difficult. What can make it easier, particularly in this time period?
Well, Ann likes to talk about there being a conspiracy of silence in most congregations, and actually some sociologists have documented that. And the way it goes is this. Clergy typically are not comfortable talking about money, and laity are very happy for them not to talk about money. So with a wink and a nod, there is no talk about money. There are several things I think that we can offer that would be of help. Well, one is when you talk about it. So many times we isolate when we talk about money to the stewardship campaign season. Maybe it's a particular Sunday, or maybe it's a series of 4 Sundays or something. And that's when we talk about it. Such speaking about money, whether it's in whatever form, including preaching, is far less effective because people have already set up their defenses there. They've been around for a number of years, many of them. They've seen these stewardship Sundays come and go. They may be hearing something new, but it doesn't sound new to them. It sounds like what they've always heard. However, if you're doing your work on money and stewardship apart from a time when people have to make any decision about that, such as a pledge, the effectiveness of that teaching or that preaching is far greater. A second thing is not just the timing, but begin with the people. Never begin with the church or the church's needs. Begin with the people. And so a beginning with the people might be like, today it might be, have you noticed that prices are going up on several items at the grocery store? Well, I was thinking about that. When, you see, that's a way of beginning with people. You come back and bring what you want to say biblically or theologically there, but it's a way of not beginning with a theory, but beginning with people. And then another thing is, if you're going to talk about money, don't talk about 10%, talk about 100%. Because God is calling us to be stewards of everything we have, including 100% of our financial resources, plus everything else we have. So you want to begin, otherwise it's going to sound as if God may be interested in our being good stewards of everything, but we're really just interested in our share of that. No, you want to help people think of how God is calling them to be good stewards of everything and always relate it to their faith journey. In terms of preaching about stewardship, one bit of research showed that when people were asked, have you heard a sermon on stewardship in your church within the last year? Where people said yes, giving was considerably better than when people said no. However, when that sermon had been more about fundraising, that is, when it was related to the church budget, when it was an appeal for the church budget, there was a negative association with that. So one way to avoid that is staying away from doing just preaching at a stewardship time. Another way that can be helpful to get people talking about money is to find some good open-ended questions. For instance, you may have a meal in connection with your campaign, or this just may be a teaching technique you use, where you ask each person in a small group to think about how you go about sharing, how you go about making your decision about giving each year. And, you have to find the right question, because if you have picture people at tables and you say to them, we're going to ask you to talk at your table about how much money you give to the church, people will probably raise their hands and say, could we talk about our sex lives instead? I mean, it's not a good subject. But if you say, how did you go about thinking about giving, your giving, whether to the church or to other things, that it begins with the presumption of grace, I would call it, where you assume they are giving. And then that's something people can talk about. Or you can ask them to, you can ask people at one table, think about a time when you were asked for money and it was done really well. And you ask another group to be thinking about a time when you were asked for money and it was really a bad experience for you. And then to talk at their table or in their groups, and then to share as if saying, we want to learn from your experience. It's a way of getting people to talk about it, or asking people, what's your first memory of talking about money in your family? And some come from families where, well, we don't talk about money, or we did. So anything like that. But finally, on this question, we offer in the book 2 rules for talking about money. The first rule is never talk about people's money apart from their discipleship. Remember, their need to give is far greater than the church's need to receive. And they are to be stewards of everything as a part of their spiritual journey. So if you're going to talk about people's money, you've got to talk about their discipleship, how it connects to their next faithful step in their discipleship journey with God. The second rule is never talk about the church's money apart from the church's mission. Whatever it is, connect it to the mission. Because if you can't connect it to the mission, then it has no reason to be in the budget at all. So we can't assume that people will make the connection. So it may be that you're behind on the mortgage, and people can understand mortgage payments, and they understand when it's hard to make a payment and what it's like to be behind. So you could just talk about that. No, you've got to say, remember what this mortgage is about. Remember the dream when we built that building. It was not about construction. We're not in the construction business. We're in the God business. We're not in the mortgage business. We're in the God business. So the only reason we're interested in that mortgage is because this is what it makes possible. And that's what we believe God's called us to do.
Very good. The next question here, Ann, let me move on to, this is we're in the National Capital Presbytery. We're blessed to be in the sort of Washington, D.C. area. We have a number of people who work for the government or government contractors. So they've been able to work from home. So a number of our churches have done well, but recent survey our committee did found out there were some churches struggling. So the question here is, how can you ask people to be generous when so many people are in financial distress in different places?
Yeah, well, that's a very timely and important question. I think it's one that's very much on people's minds as we're in this particular period. And as you indicated in the way you framed the question, and as I began earlier, we do have to appreciate the fact that everyone's individual financial circumstance has been affected differently through the pandemic. And so we can't just make the blanket assumption that no one in our congregations can afford to give. There are people whose ability to give has been negatively impacted, and there's people whose ability to give has actually been positively impacted. And so what I think that means is that we have to get out of the mindset of just always assuming that people can't afford to give. Because I have come to see that this idea people can't afford to give is kind of a fig leaf that people use when they don't want to ask people to give. And I know that sounds harsh, but over and over again, I see evidence of that. I saw it just recently in my own church when I proposed to our minister of Christian education that we might want to consider doing a stewardship education program for children, because I knew that many of our younger families weren't really, their stewardship wasn't quite what it needed to be. And she basically ignored that. And then a few days later, in another context, she started talking about how hard it was for families now and how they all had so much educational debt. And that may or may not have been true of the families in question, but I think that was her way of saying, oh no, we couldn't ask young families to give because you know how many young families have so much student debt. Well, we make these assumptions and it becomes an excuse to justify our reluctance to talk honestly with people about their financial situation and their giving. And so, the first lesson is don't make assumptions. And don't just not ask anybody, because there are some people who can't give. One gracious way that we can come about that is a lesson that Lovett taught me, which is to always acknowledge publicly that there are some people that we know can't afford to give. That's true during a pandemic time, and that's true during regular times too. There will always be within a congregation some people who are on hard times. And if you simply state that up front and say, we know some of you are experiencing hard times, this is not the time when you need to be, increasing your giving. We appreciate that. Don't feel like we're asking that of you. That not only graciously lets those people sort of, feel like they're not being pressured, but it sends the signal to everybody else in the congregation that this is a congregation that appreciates when people are in need, and they're going to feel better about giving because they know that the church has taken that into consideration. So that's another best practice, to just always acknowledge the fact that there are people who may not be in a situation, but it's not everybody. One thing that's really interesting, if you look at the data on how people give, people who are less off actually are more generous than people who are well off. That's proven over and over again. And that, I think, is something we need to ponder prayerfully uh, and because when we always think that people can't afford to give, and so we're afraid to talk with them about giving, that assumes that if people had more, they would give more. But that's not what research suggests. People don't automatically give more just because they have more, and people who have less don't automatically give less. One of the kind of countercultural messages of the Christian faith is that God wants everyone, rich, poor, young, old, everyone to experience the joy of giving. And so that doesn't mean we lean on the people who can least afford it. But I think we have to be inclusive in the way that we talk about giving and appreciate the fact that even people of modest means often find ways to be quite generous, and we don't want to take that opportunity away from them. And so, I think we just, I want to go back to what I said at the very beginning. We need, this is a time when we really need to learn the circumstances of people in our congregation. It's not just to increase their giving, but it's really to understand their needs. I mean, if there are people in your congregation who are going through severe financial distress, you want to know that, not for the context of your commitment campaign. You want to know that because the congregation needs to be able to help those people in this time. And so this is a time for really paying attention, really trying to learn what's going on in terms of people's circumstances. And first for pastoral reasons, but then also so that we can be responsible in how we talk about giving with those people. So I think my big message would be, I think the mistake that some churches have made has just been pull back entirely. This is a bad time. We can't possibly talk to anybody about giving. That kind of knee-jerk, one-size-fits-all approach to this is just not correct by so many measures. And so we need to be paying attention. We need to be acknowledging that there are people who can't give, but we also have to make sure that the invitation is there to those who are able or motivated to want to continue to give.
Good. We had a couple of questions sent in ahead of time. Then I just wanted, the first one is actually a good follow-up to what you were talking about, Ann. And I'll open up to both of you. So far, here's from a member. First, so far, we are facing a deficit this year in our church. Is it enough that we need to take, it's enough that we need to take action? How do we communicate this with our congregation, and how often?
Well, I think the congregation has a right to expect that there would be information shared about the situation, and then that somebody's minding the store, if you will, and in communicating, even if it's bad news, they need to have confidence that the people who have been given the calling in the congregation to deal with these matters are dealing with them. And again, you start with the people in their situation. As you might expect, the church has faced some challenges, just as many of you have faced challenges. And here's what we know, and then start as positively as possible. First, we want to thank you for the sacrificial way many of you have given, and the generosity of all during this time. Some of you have not been able to because your fortunes have not worked out well, but there are others who have really stepped up, and so by all of us working together, we've come a long way. However, and then you move to the negative. So you want to, and then you set yourself up to say, we're looking at some options, and we'd like to invite you to think about these options. We'd like for you to offer any other suggestions, and And so before coming to any decision about this is what we're going to do, it would be good if you could lay that out so people can say, good, they're keeping me informed, so that when you come back, no matter what the decision is of how we deal with this immediate problem, the first thing they'll remember, well, you'll want to remind people, you remember a month ago, 3 months ago, or whatever, we did this report to you. And even people that got it, didn't read it, they'll nod, because they know that happened. And then they're more open and say, we've looked at these options that we shared with you, and thank you for your ideas. And this is where we feel God has led us to go for these reasons. And this is what we're proposing, or this is what our session has done. And we wanted you to know this as soon as possible. And here's what we're doing to try to make the impact of this be least harmful.
All right, thank you, Lovett. Here's a little more broad question, but I think it's actually good. How do you feel the pandemic has changed church life? Attendance and finances, will it go back to pre-pandemic, or is this the permanent course change for us?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I wish I could. I wish we had a crystal ball in knowing what was coming next. I mean, just based on what I read, and we're keeping an eye on a lot of our trends. I think the one of the themes in what I see other people writing and prognosticating is that we're never going back. We're never going back to where we used to be. And I think that's probably right in a lot of ways. So I think this is a very liminal and fluid time when congregations are going to be, having to adapt to a lot, just as they've had to adapt to a lot in the last 15 years. I think one of the most exciting and wonderful outcomes of this is seeing how congregations have been so resourceful and nimble and quick to adapt to, things like digital worship. And that's really hopeful to me. I find great hope in how congregations have persevered in the midst of this. But I do think we're in for a continued time of change as we emerge from this post-pandemic era, because things are very, what I'm seeing in churches is a variety of different patterns, in how churches are choosing to move forward at this point. And so I think there's going to be continued change and continued uncertainty with all of the bad and some good that comes with it. So I don't think we're probably going back to normal. I think there's going to still be a real time of change and growth and disruption. Lovett, do you want to say?
No.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's also very different depending on region of the country that you live in. My church's building is still closed to everybody except for staff. And I know that that's not the case in other churches in other parts of the country, because people's sensibilities are very different. And so I think there's just going to be great variety in the ways that different congregations are going to be carrying forth their ministry in the next 6, 12, however many months.
All right. Thank you, Ann. This is from Phil on our committee, and it's related to the book. In the book, you talk about tithing as more a recent word than it was in biblical times. And should the 10% common target still be emphasized in campaign materials and from the pulpit?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. There is a chapter in the book that addresses biblical standards of giving, and we discuss tithing in that chapter. And let me begin by saying that tithing is very important in some faith traditions and some denominational traditions, and not very important in others. And so I think I just want to acknowledge from the outset that not every church and every denomination has really had a strong tradition of emphasizing tithing. And I think the question relates to the fact that in the book, we draw on James Hudnut Buehmiller, as Lovett's already quoted him. He has a book that traces the history of church finance in America and points out that tithing didn't really become popular in American churches until the late 19th and the early 20th century, as other forms of church finance were fading, like pew rentals and state support for religion. And so even in those traditions that really give a lot of emphasis to tithing, it hasn't always been the law of the church. And so that's the point that we make in the book. Now, that said, I still think tithing is a pretty good idea. So if your tradition is one that has talked a lot about tithing and giving 10%, then I think that is still a very admirable standard for people to aspire to. So I'm not saying, people should stop talking about tithing. I find it helpful to think, to ask two different questions when we think should people tithe? Are people required to tithe? Are people required to tithe biblically? I think the answer to that question is no. And if you'd like to know more about that, you can read what we've written in the book about it. But if the question is, should people tithe? I think there are really good reasons why people should tithe, because it really encourages proportionate giving and first fruits giving and all of the other biblical and theological points that we want to emphasize in how we talk about giving. The tithe incorporates those. And so if your congregation has always emphasized giving 10%, I wouldn't suggest that you move away from that based on the discussion in our book. I think the risk that congregations need to avoid is making tithing so legalistic that people feel that if they can't tithe, they don't belong in the church, or that they're not worthy. That's the problem with overemphasizing tithing, when we allow it to become a legalism. And so we don't want to emphasize it to that extent. But I'm certainly not against people talking about the tithe.
Now we're going to take a few questions from the audience here. So before I do, I'll just mention again, this was posted in the chat box. The Stewardship Committee of NCP is gifting all attendees Lovett and Ann's book. So we'll make sure you get that as our compliments, and we'll be getting that out to you. Just send, the address, it's in the chat box. You can send it to LaJuan. Her email address is there. Just send your note in there. You want the book, you attended the session, and the Stewardship Committee will arrange that and send it out to you. So we think it's that important. Okay, here's one from a pastor I'm not going to identify, but can you please comment on pastors knowing who gives what? I feel like I'm doing stewardship blind with no clue about the giving.
Lovett, do you want to go on that?
Well, no, Ann is speaks authoritatively on that, but what I like to say is, if pastors are split on this issue, sometimes as much as 50-50. Some thinking that if I know what people give, I can't be the faithful pastor I want to be, and others feeling they should know. But the question that comes back is, if you don't think you should know, what other ignorance about your members' lives would make you a better pastor? If you didn't know how often they attended worship, would that make you a better pastor? So that's a little kind of a catty way to deal with it. But as a pastor for 18 years, I didn't know. But I think, well, I know I could have functioned better as a pastor and pastoral leader had I known. Now, we have a good section in the book on that, and Anne has written separately on it as well. So I'd like for her to speak.
Yeah, so I think it's probably obvious to you based on the way I talked about approaching a commitment campaign and sort of being sensitive to what your congregants' situations are, that I think it is important for a pastor to know what people give. And that's been a constant in our work as we've worked with congregations to help enhance generosity. So I agree wholeheartedly with Lovett that I think pastors, it's to a pastor's benefit, both pastorally and in terms of encouraging generosity, to know what people give. Now, I also know it's easy for me to say that that's a good idea, and a lot harder for those of you who are in the parish to live into that reality if that's not the culture of your congregation. So one of the things we talk about in the book is, if you have had this real, and it goes back to the secrecy and conspiracy of silence around money, right? I mean, one of the reasons we want absolute secrecy about giving is because it's the same conspiracy of silence. We don't want to talk about money. We're really buttoned up about it, and it reflects that same attitude of about money being bad and money being linked to power, and that's not how it's supposed to be in the church. But how do we get to a better place? In our United Methodist denomination, there are actually a lot of judicatories that have passed sort of rules that say that a pastor has to know what people give, and I don't know that really helps very much. I think that often in the book, we give an example of a congregation that on their pledge card, they just put a little checkoff box that said, they were going to put a checkoff box on the pledge card saying, it's okay with me if the pastor knows what I give, so that people could kind of buy into it. And at the last minute, they said, oh, let's make it the other way around. Let's make it an opt-out. I'm going to check this box if I don't want the pastor to know what I give. And what they found was that the vast majority of people really didn't have a problem with the pastor knowing what they give. And that was really a helpful exercise for them. Because I think a lot of people, assume a pastor's going to know. And so I thought that was a great strategy to have that little checkbox on the pledge card. You can also, form your own, I think, regardless of whether or not the pastor, if the rule is that the pastor knows or not, there should be a policy in place about who has access to giving records. And so that can be another way to come at it, to have a conversation about who needs access to giving records and why. Because even in churches that say, oh, nobody should know what anybody gives, somebody knows, right? And so begin by asking who's that somebody and why do they need to know, and then that may lead you to think about what other good reasons there are for who to know and who not to know.
Thank you both. Here's a very interesting question from Aaron. Let me get this out. How do we approach people who don't resonate with the term pledging? Do you push it more or do you stress giving more? One colleague pointed out that no one else in our culture talks about the pledge, but many nonprofits talk about giving or sustaining or being a member. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, so I thank you for that question, because I think that, I love pledging. I'm a big believer in it. There are good reasons why I think pledge, there's great evidence that shows that people who pledge become more generous. And so I think pledging is a fantastic tool. That said, I know that there's a growing segment of people in our culture and in our churches that the idea of pledging doesn't connect as easily with them. There's something about pledging that kind of harkens back to the very institutional era. And, just as people are less quick to take membership vows these days, I think people are also much less quick to, think they're going to sign a pledge card a couple of weeks after they first walk in the door of the church. And so I think it is a good idea to acknowledge that there's probably a broad swath of people in your church for whom pledging is probably not the automatic way that they're going to start giving or think about their giving. And so, I said earlier on, we need to be creative, both and thinkers. I think I don't think that churches that have a tradition of pledging should abandon it. Somebody in my church once said, gosh, it seems like people don't want to pledge. Should we stop asking them? And I said, hey, my kids don't want to brush their teeth. I don't tell them not to. I don't say I'm going to give up telling them to brush their teeth. But knowing that there is a growing segment of people for whom the pledge sort of smacks of that type of institutional allegiance that they're just not there yet. We need to think about if the pledge is the only way we invite people to give, then we're missing the boat with those other people. And so there's a chapter in the book where we talk about fostering generosity and talk about other ways to get people started as givers. And so sometimes that's through special appeals that I think can be on-ramps for new givers. I think digital giving has huge promise in this area. We need to think about people who aren't yet ready to pledge. If the only thing we ever ask them to do is pledge, then they're not going to do it. So we need to think about other ways of getting them started as givers, and hopefully, they will come to understand that giving regularly and in a committed way has spiritual benefits, and maybe they'll eventually become pledgers, but fewer and fewer people start inclined to do that. So I think that question comes from a place of reality. Again, people give before they pledge or tithe, so we need to be prepared to think about how we invite people to take that first step into giving.
And there are a number of terms that churches will use instead of pledging. But the bigger issue, as Ann points out, is that, at least my impression is, that there's probably a declining percentage of people in congregations who are making pledges. And I started seeing this after the recession. And many of those people are still giving. But you're going to have in any church, even with a strong pledging history, you're going to have a group of people who give and don't pledge. So if you make the pledge be the standard, then you're cutting out. For instance, in one congregation that I was working with the focus had been so much on pledging, and they tracked the pledging and they tracked it by amounts and segments. And then I pointed out to them that you've got these segments, people who pledge this much or more, or from here to there, and you know how much that makes up of the giving. I said, here is a constituency you have, the people who don't pledge but give. They are your second largest giving group in the church. But you have pushed them aside. You're not even acknowledging them because they have a pledge. So you've got to find a different way and to acknowledge. For some of you, pledging just may not fit who you are or where you are at this point in your life. And if you want to make your pledge by making your gift every week or every month, we understand that. But for many of us, being able to make that estimate sets a goal and helps us to do that.
Yeah, I like to think about a pledge as a promise between yourself and God, and a way for people to be more faithful in their giving. And that is going to resonate with some segment of people who are fairly spiritually mature and fairly far along on their giving journey. It may not resonate at all with those people who are new or who have just come in the door. But I think when I said earlier, we need creative both and thinking. We need to be able to, master the basics and go beyond the basics. I think that we do need to focus on those people who are not ready to pledge, or for whom pledging may not be the way that they're ever going to give. But I also think in most churches that have pledging systems, the vast majority of their giving is coming from those pledgers. And so I wouldn't be too quick to just say, we're not going to do pledges anymore. I think we need to be both and thinkers on this, and acknowledge one size doesn't fit all.
Here's one other thing. I know you want to get on to other questions, but
No.
this relates to making your planning for your operating budget. A lot of times churches, I think, spend too much effort in saying, this is how much people pledged last fall, and this is how much they gave. That has its place, but here to me is the more important figure to track. Let's say for our budget for a particular year, the prior commitments and pledges were this amount. At the end of that year, gifts from all givers, not just pledgers, was this amount. So the pledge giving represented, say, 90% of what was actually raised, or 80%. And churches have their own personalities about that. And in some cases, that percentage may be changing and it may be becoming less, it could be more. But that's your best way of getting an estimate on that type of giving in the coming year, is to follow your kind of 3-year running average. And then once you know your pledges, it's not the payout rate, it's how that relates to what you're going to get overall. And that gives you a good way to estimate that income.
This is a quick one for you. Quick question. You mentioned house party. So Nina wants to know what a house party looks like.
Okay, well, so I've learned that people have lots of different words for house parties. My new pastor's from the Northeast, and he calls it a cottage party. Some people call it a parsonage party, but so a house party would be when, in the context of your stewardship campaign, you might have gatherings that people are invited into someone's home for a conversation around the vision of the church and around the goals of the coming year, and that conversation is part of your commitment appeal. Sometimes people might actually receive their commitment materials while they're attending one of those house parties. Sometimes they might even be actually asked to make their pledge while they're at the house party. But it's a term I use to describe a campaign that's built around small group meetings that may or may not be held in someone's home.
This is a good question here. It's probably good timing. Jim asked, how would you advise a church in turmoil, such as divisions for one reason or another, like worship style, mission changes, or a transition, such as between pastors, address potential decline in giving?
Well, you would hope that with transition of pastors, there wouldn't be a great deal of change, unless perhaps there's been some problem with that necessitated the change. Money's kind of a lagging indicator that if things are not going well, the impact doesn't come next Sunday. It will come over a period of time. That's why you want to pay attention to trends. If a church doesn't make its budget for the first time in history, the problem was not December giving. The problem goes back, and it would be better to identify where that starts. So conflict is a little different thing, and it's hard to have a lot of control of it over it on the income side, but you really do need to be paying attention to it on the expense side. And sometimes it's even severe enough that use of a reserve fund to get through a year before a new budget can be developed is a usable thing. And the pandemic has certainly helped us understand why there's a need for a reserve fund. A reserve fund is not intended to just to be a slush fund for not good budgeting, that is to cover deficits. No, the reserve fund should be used if something that we could not predict, and a major conflict often fits that, the closing of a major employer, a recession, a pandemic, those fit this. But then you need to buy some time to get to the new budget. But unless you can resolve the conflict somewhere, it's going to be a problem, or you may have to reset your baseline.
You know, I think one thing that came to my mind when I heard that question was, you know, so often when the conversation around giving in churches is around the church's need for money, the church's budget, and it's very transactional. And that means that if you're unhappy with the church, you withdraw your money, because that's how a transaction works. In fact, the reason that we're called to generosity doesn't have to do with the church's budget or the church's needs or who's in charge of the church. It's, you know, giving is always not about the church's need to receive, it's about the giver's need to give. And so I think the more we can, now of course, if you only say that when you're in trouble, that has to be your constant theology of giving, so that people understand that their reason to give isn't because they like the pastor or they don't like the pastor. It's because it's part of their expression of their discipleship and their faith. And so, that's obviously not a stopgap solution to a crisis. But I think if we kind of pull the lens back and think bigger picture about how we develop a healthy culture of generosity, making sure that's the overall framing that we put, I think makes us a little less susceptible to people saying, I don't like that budget, I don't want to pay for that, I don't like that pastor, I'm not going to give anymore. No, that's not why we give. We give for spiritual reasons, because God wants us to be generous, and so I think, keeping those basics in place as much as possible helps too.
Okay, we're getting down to the last two questions here. From Eric, is there a recommended place on the calendar, perhaps a range of months, for when work on the budget with your either trustee session or leadership?
Yeah, I think if you're on a January to December fiscal year, then I think once you get into the summer, you're at a place where you can start looking and planning, so that when you go into the fall, everything is in place in terms of a timeline for the decisions, the development of the budget, and that sort of thing. After you get past June 30th, you've got 6 months of budget history for that year. So a lot of the planning of the timeline decisions have to be made. The people that need to be consulted and involved can be made probably prior to Labor Day, and then rolled out so that you can move it through the proper governance steps by the end of the year.
And this is a question, this is an appropriate question, I think, for last one, and maybe then get a summary from both of you. This is from the book, and of course, there's a chapter on generosity. So the question here for Phil is, how can we best move from a traditional use of the word stewardship to the better, more completely word generosity?
Yeah, so that is something that I talk about in the book. I think stewardship has kind of become a garbage term for everything having to do with money in the church, and sort of a euphemism for fundraising. And the stewardship has a very rich biblical meaning that's very relevant, and we discuss it in the book. But I have found that it's harder and harder for people who haven't grown up in the church, our newer givers, our newer members, to really understand what stewardship really means, because we misuse the term so much. And so I think the language of stewardship is very important, but I personally have found that the language of generosity is an easier way to start the conversation. It's more gracious and it's more easily understood. So that's the reason that we organized the book the way we did, because I think generosity, I sometimes say stop talking about stewardship, and I really don't mean that. But what I mean is stop talking about stewardship as the only key, sort of as a catchphrase, when what we really need to be doing is talking in a more nuanced way about generosity and stewardship and abundance, but generosity being that, I think, easy starting point for people.
Good. I think that we're getting down to our last questions there. Do you guys want to summarize up, each of you, kind of last thoughts for our group here?
Well, I know there have been messages about other resources that are available, and many in the Presbytery have taken advantage of Lewis Center resources. Our weekly online newsletter, Leading Ideas, is the best way not only to get articles, but to learn of new resources or other learning opportunities. And the Lewis Center website, which is churchleadership.com, is a place you can go and subscribe to that. Also at churchleadership.com, the resources we have are in 3 categories of stewardship, church finances, and clergy personal finances. And in all those areas, there are a number of free resources. And then we have some video toolkits as well. We have some one-page, what we call to-the-point documents that easy for people to read quickly and then have a conversation about, such as the question of should the pastor know what people give. We have another series called 50 Ways to Improve Giving in Your Church, things like that can be used, very simple, practical tools that can be used by a group of people. What we try to do at the Lewis Center is to provide actionable strategic insights. That is, you have someone who has a responsibility in the church. It may be stewardship. They're committed to that. They want to do a good job, but they've not spent a lifetime studying that. And so when they get some resources with suggestions, they aren't offended by it. They welcome it. And if we can say to people, if you do these things, avoid these things, your chances of being fruitful in this are greater, people welcome that. So it's been an honor to be with you. Always great to be with people in the National Capital Presbytery.
Yeah, well, I also want to echo my thanks. I'm grateful to the Presbytery for pulling this together, and grateful for their support of our book. But I also wanted to express a word of gratitude to each one of you who is participating in this webinar. One of the things I've learned in stewardship ministry over the years is that the people who take on the ministry of stewardship and finances in church do it out of their love for the church. And so I'm grateful for your commitment to this work. I know these are challenging times and there are a lot of questions. And so thank you for staying in the game and continuing to encourage, really to make possible the ministries of your churches. I'm grateful for the work you're doing.
Yes, thank you, Ann and Lovett. But I can testify to, I get the leading ideas every week for a number of years now. And Ann, I see your simple steps to launch a planned giving program just came today. So I'm going to read that.
Yeah, that's
this
actually a
afternoon.
part out of the book. So yeah.
Good.
Mhm.
Okay, great. So yeah, we did provide those links in the chat box for you to get access to the Lewis Center resources, as well as some other resources there as well. As we said before, we will be sending the book, Compliments of the Stewardship Committee, to everyone who's attending today. You've had Luan posted her email address in there so you can get access to it. I want to thank everybody for joining us and spending this time. It's been a good hour and a half, but we've covered a lot of territory. Could have covered a lot more, but I think we've gotten some good questions and good feedback from people. Thank you both again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing everybody in a future webinar here. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.